technical difficulties before and all sorts of different settings. So I printed this out. I was joking with my wife that it looks like something that somebody on the street would give you, like manifesto. Like that looks a little crazy, but we have I was very ambitious in thinking everything that we could cover tonight, but not in a way that's so in the text necessarily. But I thought that it'd be nice. Some of us like to take it home and read it afterwards, and it's a good sort of springboard. So we're going to talk about Tanya, right? We're here 6 weeks. We're going to go through different teachings in the book of Tanya. So I want to spend some time before anything just to talk about what this book is. I've been emphasizing the radicalness of it, right? So what makes it so radical? So I brought this copy, which I was involved with printing. So one of the things that's really radical in our generation about Tanya is that the Rebbe was really adamant that everywhere in the world there should be a printing. They said they should print a Tanya. So Chabad houses around the world, people will go to very far off places and set up a printer on a car battery or on a generator and pump out 100 copies. The Rebbe set some ground rules. One of them was you have to print 100 copies. One was you have to learn chapter 32. Well, you have to learn something, and the custom is to learn chapter 32. And 32 in Hebrew is Lev, which means the heart, and it's the heart of the book of Tanya. And it's actually added later because of the importance of being the heart. And it's one of the chapters. It's exceptionally radical, and we're going to look at it later in this course. So this one, I was involved with a synagogue in Crown Heights, and we printed this one, and we made a big party out of it, and it was a lot of fun. So this one's very near to my heart. Some people have collections of hundreds or thousands of different copies from around the world. I only have a couple, but this one I like a lot. So I brought it just that it should be part of the deal, and we made it in memory of my father, among other people, Olav Shalom. So it was fun. So Tanya is this book that came about that the Alter Rebbe, the author, spent 20 years working on and honing and perfecting. And because of the emphasis that we understand the Alter Rebbe to put into how precise the language should be, the quote that we often hear is that when he would add a single letter, he would review the entire book up until that point to determine whether or not to add another letter. A letter being like vav, which means and, right? So to add an and, to affect the grammar in that way, we had to review the whole book. It was that serious an undertaking. And it was initially printed and published anonymously. There was a lot of bad blood in the Jewish world at the time, and the movement of Chassidus was not really respected or not really accepted. And he did it that it shouldn't be held back by his name, right? That it should be accepted amongst the Jewish people in its entirety. And the custom is that we start the study from the title page. The title page was authored by the Alter Rebbe. It was authored by the author. It wasn't just something that was added later. So, like everything in this book, and there's a teaching from one of the Rebbes, from the fifth Rebbe, that just like with the Torah, we know that we go back to it year after year, and there's always new layers and new levels and new things to discover. So the Tanya sort of works the same way. There are no end. There's no end to how many layers and different appreciations and understanding, and it really infuses everything that we do and everything that we understand. Personally, so there's a custom that was initiated by the previous Rebbe, that we study a portion of Tanya every day. And this is something that falls under our daily study called Chitas, which is an acronym for Chumash, the weekly Torah portion, the Tehillim, the Psalms, and Tanya, a teaching, a paragraph, or sometimes a bit more, from the book. And so with that, we finished the entire book within a year. And it can be very powerful, it can be a very enriching and uplifting experience. And I found that I was getting to a point where I was really struggling with it, and it wasn't, it felt very disjointed. You'll stop in the middle of like a page, and sometimes it's hard to sort of catch the flow. And one of the things that I did, actually during COVID, was I started learning one chapter a day before davening in the morning, before prayers in the morning. Not a lot of time, I just got married and I was hanging out at home. I had a lot of time. So I would learn one chapter a day, and the book took a whole new meaning for me. It was a new experience in how I related to it and how I understood it and how I got the narrative and the unfolding of it. So any way that we study it, it offers a lot and offers new experiences for us. So oftentimes when Chabad rabbis get up to teach Tanya, they start from the beginning and they go straight, and it's hard. The first 12 or 14 chapters, I think the tradition is the first 12 chapters, but the first 14 are like a unit in and of itself, and they sort of exist as a independent study, and it can be very nuanced, and it's hard to sort of get out of the weeds on that one to then get to the rest of the book. There's 53 chapters in the first section, which is generally what we refer to as Tanya. The other 4 sections are also relevant, and we'll be looking at them as well. But I wanted to just sort of do some greatest hits and do some really powerful ideas, these concepts that I think are radical. I think that what the Alter Rebbe presents here and the system that is developed is really different than anything. It comes out of a tradition of Judaism that is hundreds and thousands of years old, but it's a real shift in what it's teaching and what it's demanding from us, what it believes in us, and I think that what makes it so radical is that it's this book that is accessible, and with work and with endeavor, with effort, is a system that we can really use to experience real change and real growth. And I think it believes in our capacity to change and grow in a way that you don't always see in so many books. So we're going to start. I printed at the top of this paragraph, at the top of this page, I printed the title page, because the tradition is that's where we start. So I think we'll try to use this as a conversation, and we won't necessarily look at everything that's printed, because this, like I said, is quite ambitious. But it's a start for us to understand. So the title page says, Sefer Likutei Amarim, a book that is a compilation of teachings or a collection of sayings. Right? It was that vague, that abstract in its title, right? Tanya is a Talmudic word, which means it was taught, which is the first word of the book. But the book essentially doesn't have a title, right? Likutei Amarim is the collection of sayings, is as close as we get to a title. So Chelik Rishon, the first part, Sefer Shalbein, Hanikra B'Shem Sefer Shalbein, is called with the name the Book of the Beinanim. And the Beinani is a person, is a category of person, and it is the star of the show. This book is the Book of the Beinanim. It is our book, that each one of us can be a Beinani, and that's what we're going to talk about. And that's why tonight is radical identity. Tonight is exploring, acknowledging how we are sort of naturally programmed to see ourselves, and challenging that, and learning how to see ourselves in a radically different and new, encouraged and fortified divine way. So being a Beinoni is being in tune with that. And he says, Melukat Mipi Svarim Mipi Seifrim, compiled from sacred books and from sacred teachers of heavenly saintliness, whose souls are in Eden, based upon the verse, Kikar Velacha Hadavar Ma'ed Beficho Uluvavcha Lasesa. Based upon the verse that is from Deuteronomy, for this thing, referring to the system of Torah and mitzvot, is very near to you, is easily accessible in your mouth and in your heart, that we can express it through speech and we can feel it, we can feel a passion for it, for our Judaism and our connection to God. Say that you may do it, that we can accomplish that in action. And what the Alter Rebbe is getting at here is that we have this, the Torah is telling us itself that it's so easy to do, and that it's easy for us, that it's accessible, and that's a glaring question, right? That's the straight off the bat. Who says it's so easy? Who has the experience that it's so easy? A lot of us have to really work to get into a system, to develop the diligence and the discipline to be active and proactive and aligned and attuned with our Judaism, with our godly sense, right? So the Alter Rebbe says, who says it's so easy? Let's explore why the Torah can tell us, right? If the Torah tells us, then there's truth to it, right? So how do we understand it? And then he says, explaining everything, Levar Hativ, to explain clearly how it is Karev Ma'ed, how it can be so exceedingly clear. B'derech arucha u'ketzara, in a long and short way. And this is a famous line that is a hint to a Talmudic teaching. Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach. The long, short way references a Talmudic story of a rabbi who says, he lists off all the people who bested him, who got the better of him. He says, once there was a girl who got the better of me, once there was a little boy who got the better of me. And the story was that he was walking to a city, and he came to a fork in the road, and there was a boy sitting there, and he says, which way to the city? And the boy says, do you want the short, long way, or the long, short way? And he assumed that the first one was the primary, so he said the short, long way. And it took him through the woods, through an untrodden path, and it took him to the wall of the city. And he came back, and he said he took instead the long, short way, and it was a well-trodden path, but it was very long, but it took him all the way around to the center, to the gates of the city. And this is, the Alter Rebbe uses as a model for our work, for our experience in this world. There was, at the time, the Alter Rebbe was a student of the Mizritcher Maggid. The Mizritcher Maggid's name was Dovber. He was the second generation of the Hasidic masters. He was a fascinating personality. I like to often quote that there's an interview with Carl Jung, on his 70th birthday, and he mentions as an aside, he's talking about how he developed his system, and he mentions as an aside, you should know that there was a rabbi who was rich 250 years ago named Dovber who originated everything that I developed, and he was the nucleus of the Hasidic world. All of the great Hasidic masters were his students. The Alter Rebbe was the youngest, and there were lots others. And there was at the time it was really open. The Maggid had, as much as he developed a system, he was really about empowering his students to each take their strengths and their abilities and to develop paths and systems and methodologies in how to serve God. And there was a disagreement amongst these students, the Alter Rebbe being one of them, about how to most effectively do that. And this idea of the long, short way encapsulates the Alter Rebbe's argument against or with his peers, with the other Hasidic rabbis who were the students at the time. But there were others who said that there's an element of fake it till you make it, or maybe just sort of like get yourself all hot and bothered and jump up and down and feel a lot of passion and excitement, and that you'll get your heart pumping, and then you'll feel like you're really connecting to God, and you can incorporate that in your service of God. That would be the short, long way. And the Alter Rebbe said that we need a system that's very methodical, that requires small steps, but real, that can affect real, consistent, and integrated change. It's a system of alignment and of integration that is very methodical and with a real methodology to it. And it takes a lot of work, and it can take a lifetime's worth of work. And that's why it's the long, short way. But ultimately, when it's integrated and when it's approached holistically, it's short because the change can be all encompassing, and it can be really and people want to say universal, but that's not the word. But it takes the entirety of your being. So that's where we're at. So we're talking about identity tonight. So the book is the book of Beinoni. So I want to just set the stage a little bit so we understand what this concept is and how we get there and how we understand how this is speaking to us. So in chapter 1, we start with the teaching from the Talmud. It has been taught in Nida. Nida is a tractate of the Talmud. The Talmud is compiled of a bunch of different tractates about a bunch of different subjects. One of them is Nida. Each subject, the way the Talmud works is it's really a recollection of conversations, so things are very fluid, right? A rabbi will say something, and then I'll remind him of something else, and they'll go down a wormhole and a tangent of a tangent. So they say over here, Mashbi'in Isati Yatzadik Baltiya Rasha, that before a person's born, while the fetus is still in the womb, they are administered an oath. And the oath is that each one of us takes, that we take an oath saying that I will be a tzaddik and I won't be a rasha. Tzaddik is translated here as righteous, and a rasha is translated here as wicked. Both of those are terms that don't entirely grasp what we're talking about here. I left them in the English just because it's sometimes easier to refer to them, but don't think that that's the be-all and end-all of what we're talking about. I would say a tzaddik is somebody, and we're going to explore, a tzaddik is somebody who is totally aligned, totally integrated with his godly essence. A rasha is somebody who puts his ego, his self-centeredness first and foremost, whereas a tzaddik is somebody who is totally devoted to their relationship with God. Right? Somebody who is entirely selfless, entirely given over to their divine connection. And so obviously that we can see how those are two polar opposites, right? Somebody who's totally for themselves versus somebody who's totally for God. So that's how we start off this whole thing. And then the Alter Rebbe strengthens the question even further. The Talmud goes even further to say that even if the whole world tells you that you're so righteous, that you're so aligned, and that you're so integrated, you should still see yourself as somebody who's totally self-oriented, totally ego-oriented, and totally not doing the deal. And he strengthens the question to say that we have certain sources, specifically what the Mishnah, what the Talmud tells us in Pirkei Avos, that we shouldn't perceive ourselves as wicked. We shouldn't have that type of negative self-image, because that could interfere with our ability to serve God out of joy, right? It would interfere with our capacity to stay positive. And we know that depression and a misaligned or disconnected sense of self or perception of ourselves can be tremendously harmful and tremendously paralyzing. So he says, how could the Talmud talk like that? And he uses that to introduce these concepts that we have. That we're going to talk about 3 different categories, and within these 3 categories, 2 subdivisions. We said we have tzaddik and Rasha, right? Somebody who's totally for themselves, the Rasha, and somebody who's totally for God is the tzaddik. Subdividing that, we have a tzaddik v'toivlei, the tzaddik v'ralei, Rasha v'toivlei, Rasha v'ralei, ubeni. So we have the tzaddik, the person who's totally for their relationship with God, for whom it is good. In the English, they say here, at the end of the first paragraph, a tzaddik who prospers, and then a tzaddik who suffers, one who for whom it is difficult in this world. There is a Rasha, somebody who's for themselves, who prospers, who does well, one who suffers, and then the fifth category is the category of the Beinoni. Classically, we've understood the Beinoni. The Beinoni, we'll see a lot of different translations and a lot of different words used for the Beinoni because it's something that's hard to articulate. The word Bain means in between, right? It means in the middle. So sometimes you see it as a middleman. Over here it has it as an intermediate. Sometimes you see it as the average person. There's nothing average or intermediate about the Beinoni, as we're going to see. But what he's saying is that when we're trying to make this neat division in people, so the Beinoni would be somebody who splits the difference between the tzaddik and the Rasha. Somebody who splits the difference between being for themselves and being for God. How that happens, we're going to see. We're going to have to break down a lot further. But that's in its essence what the Beinoni. That's how we've classically understood the Beinoni.
It strikes me, and it may be irrelevant, that there aren't two divisions of Beinoni. Maybe later there are. Those that prosper and those that don't. Is that irrelevant at this point?
It's not irrelevant.
Jumping the gun.
So one of the things that we point out later is that this concept of toiv and ra'alei, of being of prospering or suffering, is connected with whether they are totally a tzaddik. The language that's used in Kabbalah is a tzaddik gomer or a tzaddik she'eino gomer. One who is completely a tzaddik or one who is incompletely a tzaddik. So for a tzaddik, that would be somebody who is totally, entirely eradicated any sense of self and is entirely given over to their godly core, or one who has done 98% of the work and still has some minuscule sense of self, but it's totally integrated in his divine service. For the Rasha, it would be somebody who is self-oriented, whose ego is primary and first, but still has those rare moments of selflessness. And the total Rasha, the complete Rasha, would be somebody who is entirely self-oriented, who is entirely ego-driven, who has no capacity for any experience of selflessness. So in that sense, the Beinoni can only ever be a complete Beinoni, because the second that he's an incomplete Beinoni, he would be considered a Rasha. Outside, what we're going to say is what the essence of being a Beinoni is about is that to be a tzaddik is something that's determined from above. To be totally righteous in that sense is something that is God-given, and it's something that's not expected of us. I think oftentimes we can be discouraged when we measure ourselves up against people who are of a totally different stature, and it's something that can be really difficult for us to own and to navigate. And what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that measuring ourselves up to tzaddikim is something that actually does us a disservice. And to know what our true capacity is as a Beinoni actually is more encouraging because it is accessible and because it is something that we can actually do. And a Beinoni is somebody who, in outward expression, which we're going to see in chapter 3, is about thought, speech, and action. The way we interface with the world around us can be totally aligned. And even though inside we might still experience friction, we might still experience fragmentation and a struggle with a sense of self, we can control the way we interface with the world, the way we interact with the world around us, to the point that we can be considered a Beinoni, that we can experience this alignment holistically in our interactions. That's sort of on one foot. So how do we get there? So the first part of this conversation is the second part of chapter 1. I took out a bunch in between. Like I said, we're doing the greatest hits. So the Alter Rebbe he introduced a concept that was taught by Reb Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital he lived in the 1500s. He was the primary student of the Arizal. The Arizal was a Kabbalist whose name was Isaac Luria. And he's like the Michael Jordan of Kabbalah. There's like pre and post Arizal Kabbalah, right? The same way basketball is like pre and post MJ. It's the same idea, right? It's either before, he was so radical, he shifted Kabbalah to such a degree that the entire school, the entire system changed, and then after the Arizal, everything was different. So his main student, the one who he tasked to write everything down, was Reb Chaim Vital. He was the author of all the Arizal's books. The Arizal died at 36, and he didn't write anything himself. He only taught orally. And Reb Chaim Vital he was a major rabbi in and of himself, but he was also a scribe. And so he wrote down all the teachings. He transmitted all the teachings. So he writes that every Jew, whether righteous or wicked, has two souls. As the verse says, the neshamot, the souls that I have made, which is a verse that tells us that in its context uses a plural term, neshamot, oniasisi, to tell us that it could just be referring to the multitude of Jewish people, but he understood it to mean that every Jew has two souls. The first of which is called the animal soul. The terminology in Hebrew that we use is nefesh bahamis. The animalistic soul also could be understood as the natural soul. The animalistic soul is our capacity to be, our capacity to be self-oriented stems from this animalistic soul. There's nothing inherently wrong with an animalistic soul, right? But it lacks the perception and the depth to see past itself, right? It's ultimately pleasure-seeking, or at least self-oriented. It is a lot of survivalism, right? I think in modern times we would correlate it with an idea of like the reptilian brain, right? It's like a real simple part of our existence that is not sophisticated, does not have any spirituality to it, is really sort of self-oriented in its nature. So he says, the first soul is this animal soul, and Kabbalistically we connect it with klipa. Klipa is a Kabbalistic term which refers to godliness and the covering over the concealment of godliness, right? This is something we talked about on Sunday as well. So klipa is the absence, is the vacuum, is the negative space in which there is no godliness or limited godliness. It is ultimately what gives the capacity for self-orientation. So when we talk about the soul being connected with klipa, it means that it comes from this place, it stems from a self-oriented, from lacking divine consciousness. So when we talk about the divine soul, the animal soul, we say that, we emphasize that it comes from klipa, the klipa of noga. Noga means shining or bright, and that not to get too in the weeds on the Kabbalah of it, but that there is some capacity, there is some sensitivity to godliness. Even though it's self-oriented, it has some element of being able to align, to be able to attune. And this is, he says, the source for the Jewish people's mercy and benevolence, as well as their bashfulness. It's sort of that there is an element in which even our ego and even our sense of self, when checked and when aligned, can be incorporated, can be integrated. And this is ultimately the entire goal of the system. We have this animal soul, and we have this divine soul, which is what we're going to get to in the next chapter in just a moment. And we're navigating the interplay between the two. And that when it comes to the divine soul, there's nothing novel about operating from the place of divine soul and being excited about being connected to God, right? The divine soul naturally wants to connect to God. It is our capacity, that sophisticated capacity that we have to realize godliness. And so for it to motivate us to do a mitzvah isn't it's no great feat, right? It's programmed to do so. Same way the animal soul wants to eat and take a nap, right? The real system of growth and development Tanya's teaching us is that when we align with our godly soul, we can do so, and when we put in the work and the effort, we can do so. What the ultimate outcome can be that we can even transform our animal soul. That our animal soul can become jazzed about being connected to God, and that is something that's truly radical. That's something that's truly revolutionary, right? I think that oftentimes we imagine that we have some capacity for spirituality, we have some divine connection, and that when we feel it, it's there, and when we don't feel it, we're disconnected or we're misaligned or something. And there's no way to fuse that. There's no way to bring integration to those moments that we just want to take a nap, right? But the system of Tanya, what ultimately, this idea of shifting our identity to realize what we are at our core, is to say that these moments of divine connection, these moments of expanded consciousness, can permeate the entirety of my being. Even the part of me that just wants to take a nap, even the selfish, the self-oriented part of me. So that brings us to chapter 2. Chapter 2 begins on the second page, on the back of the first page. The Nefesh Hashemis B'Yisrael, the second soul amongst Israel, Michelek Elikam Ima Mamish, is a piece of God above Mamish, which means actually or truly. And this is not the Alter Rebbe's invention, but this is the first part that is truly radical. The concept of a godly soul goes back a number of hundreds of years. The Maharal, who is the Alter Rebbe's fifth great grandfather or something. He came from the Maharal. The Maharal was a rabbi in Prague, famous for, among other things, the Golem. He made the Golem. So the Maharal employs this language. The Shalah, who lived at a similar time, he also employs this language of a Nefesh Elikis, this godly soul. The Maggid uses it all the time. And the Maggid even says this concept of Chelek Elikam Imam, that it is a piece of God from above. But the Alter Rebbe adds the word mamish. He emphasizes the veracity, he emphasizes just how truly, just how actual a piece of God it is. And that's something that I think we could say safely is radical.
Did that get translated into the English?
Yeah, they translated it as truly.
Truly, okay.
I think it deserves more emphasis than just truly, right? It's substantively and actually and entirely, right? Mamish has a connotation of that you can touch it, right? So it is wholly and entirely a piece of God, meaning that our essence, right? This divine connection that we have, which is in many ways our essence. The essence of our being, of our existence, that is totally godly, that is totally intrinsically and inherently connected and aligned. Which means that whereas we might think as we navigate life in this world that we have moments of connection, moments where we feel attuned, we might think that it's something that we have to invest a lot in, that it takes a lot of work, and maybe only sometimes we realize it. Maybe it's foreign to us, right? Maybe it's something that doesn't come easy or naturally to us. But to say that it's a Chelek Elikam Imam Mamish is that this is the core of who we are. That our natural state, our resting state is connected. is totally aligned and totally divine. And it's a function of living in this physical world that we might lose sight of that, or that it might be difficult to navigate or difficult to access, but that when we integrate into the core of our consciousness that this is our essence, so then our whole existence becomes different, right? Our whole sense of who we are. We're no longer a physical being navigating a physical world. We're no longer an animal soul who wants to nap and eat hamburgers, right? Right? We have something that is ours, that is our unique connection, that is totally divine, that is totally aligned. And he uses the verse, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, the verse that refers to the creation of Adam in the beginning of Genesis, that God blew a soul into his nostrils, the breath of life, to say, and as we echo in the morning prayers, va'atam afaftabi, that you breathed the soul into me. We affirm for ourselves every morning. And the Alter Rebbe leans into the metaphor here. When we think about breath, when we think about breath work, we can think about the breath that we have when we talk. That when we speak out, we don't have to take a really deep breath, but we can say a lot of things it doesn't require a lot of air. But when we blow up a balloon or when we blow out candles, you take a deep breath in and you take a deep breath out, and it really comes from your core, right? It comes from deep down inside. So in that metaphor, we can understand the source of our soul. Our soul is rooted in the same element, that just like we're told that God speaks everything into existence, that everything is an expression of God's words, of God's speech, but our soul is rooted much deeper and employs that same metaphor as the deep breath that we take to exhale. And this, I think we'll come back to this at the end, I want to include a little meditation in each class, especially that we can do on our own time as homework. So much of what the Alter Rebbe system is in the book of Tanya is about meditation. It's about bringing that God consciousness to the forefront, and that's really how we shift and how we integrate this system. How we shift our consciousness and integrate this system to be more present, to be more attuned to what our core self is. So this is our second soul. Second, because there's an interesting conversation as to why it's referred to as the second. But this is really the core of our being. And that when we think about our experience in this world, so we have our physical existence, our body, we have our animal soul, our natural soul, our more self-oriented existence, and then we have this divine-oriented existence, this divine intrinsic connection. So let's break down each one of these souls a little further. In chapter 3, he says, each one of these souls, each one of these spiritual existences consists of 10 faculties, which are referred to as the 10 sephirot, the 10 spheres through which we express ourselves. They're broken up into 2 major categories, the 3 mothers and the 7 multiples, which are, the 3 mothers are intellectual, insight or wisdom, understanding or exploration, extrapolation, and das, knowledge, connection. That is our intellectual capacity. That is what our intellect is comprised of. I told on Sunday the story of Archimedes. Right? You know the story of Archimedes with Eureka? Archimedes was tasked to determine the weight of the king's throne, and he was trying to figure out a way to he couldn't make a scale that was big enough. So he was working on it, and then he one day went to go take a bath, and he displaced the water in the bath, and he realized that that's a way to measure weight, and he couldn't articulate it. It was this moment of insight, right, that preceded language. And so the tradition goes that he ran through the streets of, it's not Syracuse, it's another town in Greece. But he ran through the streets naked, screaming, Eureka.
There's somebody there.
Can you say the names again? Lisa? Nefesh?
Nefesh,
Nefesh?
Ruach,
Ruach?
yeah, and Neshama.
Neshama.
So Nefesh is, so there, we break it up into three. They are really three sort of consciousnesses in our soul, right, in our spiritual existence. The Nefesh is sort of like the baseline. Ruach means a spirit. And then Neshama is another word for soul, but it's more elevated, it's more aligned, more attuned. Nefesh would be like the sort of the functional existence. Ruach would be a spirit, maybe more connected with emotions, and then Nefesh could be, Neshama could be understood to be more intellectual, maybe. There's a lot of different ways that we break it down. So that's Chabad. That is Chachma Bina Das, wisdom, understanding, knowledge, or insight, extrapolation, and connection. And in chapter 3 over here, he really defines each one of them, which is relevant for when we get to the later chapters, insofar as the more we know about our soul, the more sensitive we can be to being present to our godly capacity. So one of the things that we'll see in chapter in 12 and 13 is the more we're able to integrate the divine insight that we have, this divine insight that sort of comes from outside of us, right? The more we're able to integrate that consciousness, the more we're able to bring divinity, to bring godliness into our experience. That's the tools that we have to access our divine soul. So that the Alter Rebbe says here that Chochmah, this idea of insight, is called Kayach Ma, our potentiality for what is, our capacity for what is. It's this sort of theoretical, abstract capacity. Ma meaning what, meaning it has no substance. And Koach being the ability or the capacity. And so it's this ability to solicit out of thin air, right? Out of potentiality, the beginnings of a formation of a thought, of an experience, of an emotion, or of a consciousness. So that is briefly, when we talk about the souls, this is sort of the composition of the soul. The soul is ultimately totally singular in its core, in being divine, right? Anything that's godly is singular, is not a composite of multiple, that's rather singular in that sense. So the soul is not composed of these 10 faculties, and it doesn't even really consist of these 10 faculties, but it expresses itself through these 10 faculties. And the more we're able to understand that, this takes us to chapter 4, on the bottom of the second page, which is thought, speech, and action. Right? Thought, speech, and action, we're told, are the three garments. And this is a metaphor that's employed often in Kabbalah and in Hasidic thought, that garments are the ways in which we express ourselves outwards. Right? Clothes express certain things about us. We spoke about this on Sunday in the relationship between concealing and revealing. Right? So clothes conceal our body, but they also express certain elements of us, or certain elements, certain things about us. And so when we talk about the Beinoni, when we talk about the way in which we relate to the world around us, what we said is that whereas somebody who would fall into the category of a tzaddik, somebody who falls into the category of being totally selfless and totally committed to their divine relationship, to their God consciousness, so both internally and the way they express themselves outwardly reflects that consciousness. The Beinoni is to say that internally there can be a struggle, and that We don't have to have it all figured out. We don't have to be totally aligned in our internal makeup. There's room for that struggle there. But our thought, speech, and action are things that we can control. They're things that we can be in control of, and then we can choose how to employ them, and we can choose to reserve them for positivity. And the ability to do that comes from the sense of identity, comes from the sense of being able to say, I am divine in my core, I am godly in my essence, and so I'm going to choose where I invest myself, how I express myself, right? My feelings, my emotions, and my intellect are not necessarily under my control. They're not necessarily something that I can, it's not necessarily a ship I can actively steer. Sometimes I got to be there in the difficulty and the struggle of it, but the way I choose to express myself, even for a moment, I can be conscious of that and I can make that decision. There's a story that's told, and this I think really highlights the essence of what Tanya is about. There's a story that's told of a chassid who lived not too long ago, who was referred to as a Beinoni, right? Who the Rebbe called a Beinoni, and the way I heard the story, his grandson asked him, like, what's the secret? Like, what's the deal? And he said, pull a book of Tehillim, a book of Psalms off the shelf, and say a chapter of Psalms. So he did that, and he said, what were you doing with your machshava? What were you doing with your thought at the time? And he said, I was thinking about the words of the Tehillim that I was saying. He said, what were you doing with your dibur, with your speech? I was speaking out the words. What were you doing with your maisa, with your action? I was holding the holy book and saying these words. And he said, so for that moment, you were a Beinoni. You were totally in control of your thought, speech, and action, and you had them aligned entirely for goodness, for positivity. He said, at least the way I heard the story was, that he said the trick is, or the goal is, to elongate those, that those moments should proliferate your day, and they should become longer and longer, right? Instead of a fleeting moment of one chapter of Tehillim, extend it that it should be an hour, and then the whole day, and that's, right? But it comes with those little changes. It comes with one moment of being totally present and totally dialed in to what we're doing, to how we're connecting. And in that moment, that can be a world, that can be a lifetime worth of work. And if we taste that for a moment, then we can begin to elongate it, we begin to replicate it. It should infuse the rest of our day. So that's Parak Dalet, that's the fourth chapter, is these garments. And then we come to 12, 13, and 14. And we'll do them on one foot. There's a lot to talk about here. It really dives into what the Beinoni is about and what the experience of the Beinoni is. In 12, the Alter Rebbe introduces this concept of the Ir Ktana, the small city. And this is a metaphor that the Alter Rebbe introduces to help us conceive and help us understand how we see ourselves. Instead of identifying with our physical form as the be-all and end-all of or the entirety of our existence, we can see our physical being as the battleground, as the small city upon which there are these two battling forces, right? There is the force of the divine soul, and there is the force of the animal soul. There is the force of wanting to connect to God, and there is the force of wanting to self-preserve and self-orient and self-indulge. And the body, instead of seeing our body as our conscious being, right? The body is merely the set for this show, for the showdown to take place. And that with this consciousness, we can be present to the moments that we're doing something positive, the moments that we're doing something selfless, whether it's for another person or whether it's in connecting to God. Those are moments that our divine soul is in control of our body. And then we can feel attuned, we can feel aligned with our divine soul, we can be conscious of that, right? the moments that we're, eating Twinkies and hanging out on the couch is probably our animal soul, right? It's hard to say always, but that's probably what's going on. So being conscious of that is how we learn how to navigate, learn how to integrate the divine, our divine core, our divine sensibilities. And that towards the end of chapter 12, in this paragraph, he says here, because the brain rules over the heart by virtue of its innately created nature. And this is a concept, this is the tool that the Alter Rebbe gives us to understand, to learn how to navigate these difficulties, these trying times, where we feel overcome by our sense of self, by our sense of self-orientation. That oftentimes our heart is what's driving us to orient towards the couch or the Twinkies, right? And our brain, right, our heart is hot, it's full of passion, it's full of fire. Our brain is cold, it's cool and calculated, right? We could think of it as being connected with water in that sense. So the brain is our ultimate tool. The expression that the Alter Rebbe uses in Hebrew is Me'ach shalit al lev, the brain rules over the heart. And that learning how to access the brain is not just a matter of thinking ourselves into submission or into connection, but what he's saying ultimately is that the seat of the divine soul is in the brain. Right? The brain is the most sophisticated part of ourselves as human beings, and our divine soul, which is our most sophisticated being, is seated in the brain. And from the brain, it goes out to the rest of the body. And our heart is our animal soul, right? The animalistic passion and vigor, that's all the heart. So when we use the divine soul, to use the divine soul over the animal soul is to bring the brain in over the heart. That's what it means to bring the brain in. That's what it means for the brain to control. And he continues to say, for this is how man is created from birth, that each person may, with the willpower in his brain, restrain himself and control the drive of lust that is in his heart, preventing his heart's desires from expressing themselves in action, word, or thought. Right? Not necessarily that we can eradicate that feeling, and not necessarily that we're meant to eradicate that feeling or that passion, but that we can learn how to mitigate it and manage it by orienting and integrating our brain consciousness, our divine soul consciousness. And it is for this that he says, thus it is written, then I saw that the wisdom excelleth the folly as light excelleth darkness. That wisdom overcomes foolishness just as light overcomes darkness. That is to say, just as light has a superior power and dominion over darkness, so that a little physical light banishes a lot of great darkness, right? You have a little light that pushes away a tremendous amount of darkness. And it does it automatically. The English here is really difficult. It's harder than the Hebrew in some ways, which is therewith inevitably superseded as a matter of course and necessity. What he says is that a little physical light pushes away the darkness, me'ela v'memela, automatically and naturally by the function of how light works in relation to darkness, right? Darkness is being this vacuum, this absence of light. So as soon as light is introduced, the darkness is pushed away. So too, kach nidcha memela sichlas harba shel klipa v'sitra achra shebechol asmali. So too, when we integrate a little bit of our divine consciousness, we can totally transform a lot of our animalistic consciousness, of our self-oriented consciousness. That's the last line in the paragraph from Yud Beis from 12. So then he continues in 13. And let's wrap it up now in 14. In 13, he uses this metaphor to say, in further exploring this idea of the light over the darkness, he uses a different metaphor of judges. And that each person gets a say, the divine soul gets a say, and the animal soul gets a say over how to use out the body. Each one gets a say, and that we have a principle in halacha that when there are two judges that have a disagreeing, the third judge comes to settle the dispute, and that God is the third actor in this conversation. When it's the divine soul versus the animal soul, God comes to help the divine soul, and so when we lean into that, when we recognize that we have this intrinsic connection, this divine consciousness that helps us access God's infinite power, and in these moments that we're feeling struggle, that we're feeling difficulty, we can lean into that to overcome, to control ourselves, to control how we express ourselves, how we integrate, or how we interface with the world around us, rather, and that we do so only for positivity, and we control any expression of negativity. And this he concludes, the rank of Beinoni, the element of Beinoni, is attainable by every person, and every person should strive after it. Any person at any time or any hour can be considered a Beinoni, because the Beinoni does not revile evil, for that is a feeling entrusted to the heart. Not all times are alike. Meaning to say that in any moment we can have this total connection, this total consciousness. We can be in control of how we express ourselves, and it doesn't require us to shift or to eradicate or to lose sight of who we are. It doesn't require us to delude ourselves. It doesn't require us to convince ourselves that we've done work that we haven't done, or that we're made up of something that we're not. It requires us to be real with ourselves, to recognize the limitations of our intellect, the limitations of our emotions, the ways in which we're not in control of those, and recognizing that which we are in control of. And it all comes from recognizing the connection that we have, the divine source that we have, recognizing our identity as being godly, as being divine, and that God believes in us, and that God empowers us to overcome our limitations, to be in control of how we express ourselves, and that's a divine mandate, and that it's a divine fortification, if you will, right? That God fortifies us to be able to do that, and that we can navigate life and think to ourselves, feel experiences of inadequacy, that I'm not this holy person, and I'm not aligned, and I'm full of struggle and strife. But it's in fact, this is part of what we're here for. And in a later chapter, the Alter Rebbe says that Ulay Kaf Mitzarta, maybe it was for this experience, for this struggle, that a person is created, and this is where a person really has to find themselves. But the essence of what the Alter Rebbe is saying here in these first 12 chapters, obviously on one foot in a real greatest hits form, in a real brief survey, is that this divine core that we have is our intrinsic connection and is the essence of our identity. And that learning, using the corpus and the system of Torah and mitzvahs, helps us to connect to that and helps us to align with that as the essence of our being. And we can overcome any difficulty and can integrate real growth with that. And that's in this really beautiful paragraph in chapter 14. The Alter Rebbe writes in the first person and says that a person in the middle, a person could declare to themselves, I will not be wicked for even a moment, because I will not be parted and separated, heaven forfend, from the one God under any circumstances, being mindful of the admonition, your iniquities interpose between you and God. My real desire is to unite my nefesh, my ruach, and my neshama, the entirety of my soul with God, through investing them in his blessed three garments, namely action, speech, and thought. right? The verse in Isaiah says that your inequities, your mistakes, your classically translated as sins, right? But your missings of the mark, your missteps, your
Lapse.
yes, thank you. Interposed, they separate between you and your God. And what's always emphasized is that the separation is something that we might experience consciously. Beinechem uvein elikechem means between you and your God. The separation is not from God's perspective. One can't be separated from God, but our conscious experience can be separated, and we can choose to be separated, and we can choose to be connected. And the Alter Rebbe writes in first person here is a meditation for each one of us when we're feeling overcome, when we're feeling like we're struggling and like we're disconnected, that we can say these words and then we can align ourselves to say that I choose connection over all else. I choose to invoke and integrate my divine being, and that fortifies me to transform myself, to integrate growth, and to be radical in how I see myself and how I envision my existence. So that is definitely, this whole paragraph is a meditation in and of itself. I just wanted to share one meditation that we can each think about over the week as we, in preparation for next week, is that there's a teaching of the Maggid, of the Bezutra Maggid, who we mentioned before. We emphasized in chapter 2 that the divine soul is breathed into us, right? And we echo that every morning in davening in our morning prayers. And the last verse in the book of Psalms is Kol HaNeshama Tahallelujah Hallelujah. May all living thing praise God. And the Talmud tells us neshama, this word that is being used for all living thing, which means soul, is connected with breath. Neshima is a breath, right? That's how we get this whole idea. And the Maggid says that when we breathe, when we inhale the omnipotent, we inhale the omnipresent, we inhale the infinite, right? And then we reach a moment that we can't inhale anymore, and at that moment we immediately exhale. So on the inhale, we meditate on the Ein Sof, on the infinite that is infinitely present, and on the exhale, we meditate on that which cannot be contained. That we can take it in for a moment, but it's uncontainable, and so immediately we exhale. And it is in that we can begin to the breath work can be to center ourselves, to reflect on just how present God is in every moment, just how present in this physical space is the divine, and that just as it's present in the aggregate, so too is it present inside of us. That's the essence of what our divine soul is about. That's the essence of integrating the consciousness of our divine soul. Thank you everybody for coming. I don't have a watch, so I hope we didn't go too over. It's still light out, so I figured we're probably okay. So next week is going to be, I think next week we're going to talk about joy, but maybe brotherhood, one of the two. Yeah, thanks for coming. You can keep this if you like. And in future ones, God willing, I hope it will look a little nicer.
That was great.
It was fine.
Okay.
I can almost hear him banging his fist on the table at the end of the...
Yeah, right?
As for me, I have no desire to be such a fool as he to deny the truth.
Yeah.
Is this the summary of the Tanya?
This is the text taken from. I took certain passages from chapters.
Oh, okay.
So moving forward, I would say the majority of the rest of the classes are going to be a bit more focused, and so it'll probably just be like one chapter. There'll be passages from one chapter, maybe two, but it won't span 14 chapters like this one. This was like a real ambitious endeavor to get us off the ground.
So this is like we're gonna cover all these in details, right?
No,
No,
we're gonna look at
no.
other chapters moving forward.
Oh, okay. This is like a summary of today, but we're not gonna get to these anymore.
Right,
Okay.
right. But you can hang on to it and read it in the English, and there's certainly a lot that I skimmed over that you can go back to. And you know, if in future classes you want to ask me about something in these, I'm happy to come back and talk about them as well. It's just how do we stop this? There we go.